Hello everyone, and I hope that all of you now are very awake, not sleepy after the lunch. Have a good lunch, right? So I'm sure that you will feel very interested in our panel because a lot of things will be shared and discussed by our distinguished panelists. I think our leading experts in this field, as Chum introduced. And may I start first with Dr. Jonathan Pincus. Dr. Jonathan, I think that before we go into details about the trade and investment, economics and trade relations between the two countries, I think that it would be helpful if you could help us to envision, I think, the bigger context that the two economies, the US and Vietnam, plays in, and particularly with the current development of the Vietnamese economy, how important the relationship, economic relationship, particularly the trade relationship with the US play to the Vietnamese economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me today to this very important event commemorating the bilateral ties between the US and Vietnam. I should start by saying that I've been promoted to former UNDP economist, but I'm still presently UNDP economist, and I have to say that in case there's anyone from the UN in the room who will go back and report to the security that I've escaped. Yes, it's a really good question. It's a really good point of departure, I think, talking about the economic relationship between Vietnam and the US. I think one of the things that we teach in policy school about economic development, and I think one of the most important lessons that one can learn about economic development is the importance of exports. There are no recorded examples of developing countries that have succeeded in their development without the rapid growth of exports. That is a fact of life, and we can debate it, we can analyze it, we can argue about it, but it is one of the very few regular consistent empirical findings that we have about development. You need to export. And in that context, the US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement in 2001 was a real breakthrough, a very important breakthrough for Vietnam. And it's important to remember that, I think, as we look back at the history of the relations between our two countries. It was very brave for both parties, for different reasons, obviously. But it took some courage on both sides to reach this bilateral agreement. And for Vietnam's economy, it was a turning point. And if we look at the growth of the economy since 2001, and again, following on from the bilateral trade agreement, we had the WTO agreement in 2007, accession in 2007, and then a succession of free trade agreements. But I think the US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement is what kicked it all off, and what gave, in part, the government of Vietnam the courage to move ahead with these other agreements, and for Vietnam to emerge since that time as a real leader, regionally and globally, in both agricultural and manufactured exports. And I think that's one of the most important things we can learn about Vietnam. I have a very pretty picture, which maybe we can show the pretty picture instead of the numbers. As an economist, I find it very difficult to talk without graphics, so indulge me for a moment. Do we have the beautiful picture? The graph?
This one.
Yeah. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So this looks complicated, but it's actually quite simple, and I'd like to sort of shape my remarks with this one picture. So, as I've said, Vietnam is a major and important regional and global exporter of agricultural and manufactured goods. We can think about the growth of exports along two dimensions. One is competitiveness, and one is dynamism. So if we define competitiveness as the percentage of a country's exports that are growing, so among the thousands of things that Vietnam exports to the US, this is all exports to the US, among the many thousands of products that Vietnam exports to the US, what percentage of those are increasing as a share of US imports? So in other words, among Vietnam's exports to the US, what percentage of those goods are increasing their market share? That's competitiveness. Dynamism, we can think about in another way, is among those commodities, which commodities are growing as a percentage of US imports? So in other words, which of those commodities are becoming more important to US trade? So they are commodities where the market in the US is growing, right? As opposed to competitiveness, which is to what extent is Vietnam outcompeting the other exporters to the US? And I think what the picture that this shows is quite interesting. If we go back to the figure, to the graph, you can see that Vietnam is extremely competitive. It is, aside from China in the 1980s and 90s, it is the most competitive among these countries, which are, large developing countries and Southeast Asian neighbors. Vietnam is the most competitive. In other words, its exports are growing in just about every export category to the US, which is really impressive. I mean, extremely impressive. But Vietnam is not as dynamic as some other countries, meaning that a lot of Vietnam's exports are not increasing their share of the US market in the sense that they are exporting things like, for example, footwear and maybe some agricultural products that are not growing as a share of total US imports. So Vietnam is very, very competitive. As we know, Vietnam is a very low-cost producer, but it's not yet producing the commodities that are becoming more important to the US market. Now, the other thing I want to talk about this picture is that what's happened in a lot of the Southeast Asian economies is that after the East Asian financial crisis in 1998, they became less competitive. And also China, interestingly, from the 1980s and 90s to more recently, China's exports have become less competitive in the US. But Thailand clearly epitomizes this trend. Its exports are a lot less competitive in the US and becoming less dynamic. Philippines also is very uncompetitive and has become less dynamic. Unfortunately, we don't have two data points for Vietnam. We just have one data point for Vietnam. Malaysia is the outlier, has become a little bit more competitive, but also a little bit more dynamic. Well, what does this mean? I mean, what are the commodities that we're talking about here? Well, if we look at the table, I think what we see is that, in terms of the commodities that these countries are exporting to the US, what are the most competitive and what are the most dynamic? I think that among the more dynamic countries, electronics, particularly high-tech electronics, are the most dynamic and play an incredibly important role in the export growth and dynamism of the developing economies. That's an important lesson. Now, there are two worrying things, I think, about this finding. One is that the question about the middle income trap. You know, are the other Southeast Asian economies starting to show evidence of a middle income trap, becoming less competitive and less dynamic after the East Asian financial crisis? And the second question is, what about protectionism in the US? I think that China has become somewhat less competitive, not because costs are rising in China, but because the US has started to block Chinese imports, right? So the US is raising tariffs and the US is imposing non-tariff barriers on China. And that's worrying for China, but it's also worrying for the rest of the region if that trend were to continue, if the US were to take a more protectionist stance. And in that context, perhaps Xuan Tang will talk about this in his comments as well. There is some cause for concern. I mean, there's a recent CHIPS Act, which is basically a $50 billion subsidy for Intel to bring silicon production back to the US. There are legitimate reasons for that. I mean, there are military concerns, defense security concerns, but is this the beginning of a protectionist trend that could have a long-term impact on countries like Vietnam that depend very heavily on exporting more dynamic products to the United States? I think that's enough for me. I think I'll leave it there. Perhaps we can come back to some questions, and I'd like to particularly hear what my colleagues on the panel think about these trends, both the potential for U.S. protectionism to affect countries like Vietnam, and also the relative decline of competitiveness among some other Southeast Asian economies, and whether Vietnam will be able to escape that wider regional trend. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pincus. And I think that it will open perfectly for our next panelists, professors, our faculty, Mr. Nguyễn Xuân Thành. I think I have a question for you for the comment that given the line that Dr. Pincus talked about the rise of protectionism in the United States, and recently that the U.S. government announced the economic framework for Indo-Pacific, they mention a lot about the free trade, but what can we say about this, I think, conflicting trends and how it affects Vietnam, I think.
Thank you, Vietlam, for that question. So from Dr. Pincus' comment, yes, Vietnam's exports are increasingly very competitive, and the country's overall economic development strategy will still be deeper economic integration with the world, and the US remains the single most important market for Vietnam. And both under President Trump's economic nationalism policy and also under President Biden's I have to say, inward-looking economic policy, it's a big concern for Vietnam development prospect. And of course, so the good news is that after almost 2 years, the Biden administration finally announced back in May in Tokyo the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF. So for me, two positive things from that. One is, of course, they keep it very vague so that a lot of countries in Asia are willing to join. We have the US plus 12 countries. So all of the Asian economies that are part of CPTPP are in IPEF, and almost all of the RCEP, Asian economies, of course, except Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are also in IPEF. The second thing is specifically for Vietnam, because IPEF has 4 pillars. Connected economy, involving digital trade, and fair trade, meaning labor and environmental standards. The second pillar is resilient economy, involving supply chain and minimizing the risk of supply chain disruptions. The lesson we learned out of 2 years of COVID. The third pillar on the clean economy, involving renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure development. And the fourth pillar is on fair economy, that involve the issues of taxation and anti-corruption practices. So in order to welcome as many important economies in Indo-Pacific region, the US is sending out a message that any country joining can specifically choose any of the pillars. You don't have to join all 4, right? But if you look at all those 4 pillars, Vietnam is willing to do all the 4, right? All the 4. So that's the second good news, but I guess that's the only 2 things, positive. And then now it remains to be specific negotiations, and there are many, many challenges. The first one is looking at IPEF, right? So the US is very clear in trying to signal that first, it's not a security arrangement, right? It's the security is the Quad that we mentioned in the first panel. The second thing is also not a free trade negotiation. Then, what it is, nobody can say for the moment, right? So it's because talking about free trade agreement now in the US is politically very toxic. And as long as it's not, and if it means a security arrangement, then for many Asian countries still have big concern about China, then you can also not be willingly joining that any kind of security arrangement. So, but for many Asian countries, especially like Vietnam, right? If it's not a free trade, then what is the potential benefit? Because for Vietnam, as Jonathan mentioning, for Vietnam it's still market access. And the US is saying, okay, IPEF is not about market access. It's not about tariff and other trade barriers reduction. All right, so that's the big challenge. I think the second one will be on specific pillars. Right? So the first one on connected economy. So Vietnam, of course, is fully on board with the digital economy. Right? So right now, the digital economy in Vietnam is a $20 billion economy. And various projections put it somehow like by the end of this decade, it will be around 60 billion. That put Vietnam second in ASEAN, just behind Indonesia. And the driving force behind that digital information is the startups in Vietnam, but with financing coming from Asia, with very little financing actually from the US. Right? And somehow the prospect is that will IPEF promote that? Right? And for the US right now it's very vague, and they want also emphasize on fair digital trade, not promoting digital transformation, digital economy in this part of the world. So unless that message is somehow, and even the negotiations can be more specific, I think Vietnam and many other Asian countries will not expect a lot of benefits coming out of that. And then also part of that connected economy, digital trade is only one part. And then the US want to focus more on labor and environmental standards. I don't think it's a big challenge for Vietnam, because already during TPP negotiation, Vietnam also and the US come into a lot of agreements on that. But it's the other Asian economies, in particular Indonesia and the Philippines, that are not part of CPTPP. The second one on resilient economy, I think for Vietnam it sounds very, very good, the term resilience, because both the US want to be resilient and Vietnam, after 2 years of COVID, want to be resilient. But the concern is that whether the US want resilience or they want protectionism, right? And whether they want onshoring or just nearshoring. And Vietnam's strategy is still market access, attracting foreign direct investment, still pinning its hope on globalization, right? So if the second pillar is not actually resilience, it's about protectionism, but term as onshoring, reshoring and or nearshoring, then also Vietnam will not see a lot of benefit from the second pillar. The third one on infrastructure and renewable energy, and that's I think that's very promising, right? So I think given the Vietnamese government commitment in COP26, there are a lot of momentum for renewable energy. But then the challenge is it's both on the US, but also on Vietnam side. PDP-8, Vietnam Electricity Development Plan, is still, I mean, like in a state of, I have to say, chaos. It's not clear, and once it has to, I mean, like we can see what it's actually really about, then I can see potential incentive for Vietnam in joining serious negotiation with the US on the third pillar. And lastly, I think taxation and anti-corruption. I think it's big. Potentially this is, and that also should be related to digital economy in terms of data sharing for taxation and anti-money laundering and anti-corruption. But always politically, it's not an easy stuff. So I see that's the lot of challenges for the US and other Asian countries, including Vietnam, to now in the last 2 years of the Biden administration to go to at least get some serious negotiations going. And it's important strategically because otherwise, if IPEF fails, right, and you see, okay, 3 years ago, everybody was excited about CPTPP, and now the US is out of it. And now we are excited about IPEF, and in the next 2 years, nothing happened, then okay. Maybe economically, we have to think of something else.
Thank you, Professor Xuân Thành, for the very insightful analysis. And I think that when we think about something else, maybe the question I will ask our panelists later about, I think, economic agreement or arrangement led by China or other countries, if these initiatives continue failing, right? But when I listened to Dr. Pincus and Professor Xuân Thành, I thought about, in this relationship, I mean economic relationship, it seems to be there's an unbalance of interest. It means that for Vietnam, the US play a much more important role, right, in providing us market access and help to develop our economy. But in the other way, how Vietnam can improve its leverage in the relationship with the United States in terms of economic benefits. So that's why I would like to listen from Mr. Vũ Tú Thành. I think that as a person who worked very closely on behalf of the US companies in Vietnam, try to promote the foreign investment from the US into Vietnam. You may have a lot of, I think, observations and also recommendations on how to improve the investment. And I think that by that way, improve the Vietnamese position, Vietnamese stake in the US. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. Let me rephrase Lem's question. Can the United States live without Vietnam? Yes. Can Vietnam live with Can the United States live without Vietnam? Yes. Can Vietnam live without the United States? It's hard to say. Is that your question? And the question, and you want to know that, well, how can we make the answer to the second question more clear, right? And hard to say, it's just a polite way of saying, right? Everybody knows what the real answer is. And I like the way you put it, Lem. It's true. But the good news is, and I'll give you an anecdotal example. When Vice President Kamala Harris visited Vietnam last year, she was supposed to join a roundtable with the top American manufacturing operators in Vietnam to discuss supply chain security, which was disrupted by the pandemic, right? Eventually, she could not join, but her advisors on the trip joined that roundtable with us. And that showed that Vietnam actually is an important factor in the supply chain, the global supply chain for the American market. And it's in the United States' interest to ensure that Vietnam gets out of the pandemic with as little damage as possible, because Vietnam's security, economic security, right, would help ensure the global supply chain security for the United States market, right? So in that sense, right, it answers part of your question. The next part is how to increase, right, the importance, the relevance of the Vietnamese economy, of the Vietnamese manufacturing base, of the Vietnamese market to the United States, right? In terms of manufacturing base, there is great room. There's a lot of room for improvement on all three fronts, right? Manufacturing base, more and more American companies are interested in either expanding their existing operations in Vietnam or making new investments here. You have observed over the last couple of years the reorganization of the supply chain, especially in the semiconductor industry, right? The likes of Dell and Apple, right, having their vendors move to Vietnam with investments of billions of dollars, right? In terms of the market, American exports, while being dwarfed by Vietnam's exports to the United States, has steadily increasing, over the years, right? It's not as much as Vietnam's exports to the United States, but it's still increasing, and there's a lot of room, right, for reducing the trade deficit between the two countries. There are a lot of big ticket items, as we say, that Vietnam can tap in order, right, to increase Vietnam's relevance to the U.S. economy. Let's look at, say, aircraft or aviation. Let's look at energy, such as LNG, and the entire energy value chain, right? So if Vietnam can sort out its own problems, for example, regarding PDP-8, the National Power Development Plan, it can sort of open the market, right, for investors, and especially the renewable investors. We have seen a lot of interest from wind power investors, and they're all talking about projects that are worth billions of dollars, especially for offshore wind projects, right? The regulatory framework is non-existent in Vietnam to allow such investments to begin right away. But if Vietnam gets it right, we can see an influx of such investment. So all in all, I think Vietnam has a realistic opportunity to increase its relevance to the United States, and we can realistically hope to see a probably not too distant future where it's very hard for the United States to live normally without Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. Vũ Tú Thành. I think that a lot of questions will be followed the comments made by our panelists, but I would like to ask more before I give the space to you, because I think that our panelists to come back, I think, about the future of IPEF. You mentioned something, but given, I think, the current challenges to the implementation of this initiative, I think for a long time we heard a lot about, I think, initiative like Pivot to Asia or and now currently now that Indo-Pacific strategy, and with the economic framework to replace CPTPP, but everything now more than like, I think, announcement rather than, I think, reality, right? So that's why I would like to ask you about the future of these things, particularly when the global economy and also the US and Vietnam economy face a lot of challenges and political factors. When I think that Ambassador Vinh said that we have a small window of opportunity when the two governments, we face a new election, right? Both government, isn't it 2 years? So how you see these factors in calculation when we talk about the future of this initiative? Yeah, anh Xuân Thành first.
Okay. So I think, like I mentioned, the challenges, and for me, I'm not optimistic about the coming negotiations under IPEF. But if the US and other members of IPPF are serious, they can find some common grounds. For example, for Vietnam and the US, on the first pillar, right, coming back to the connected economy. So, of course, for Vietnam, they see digital trade, right, as potential benefit. And for the US, labor environmental standards. And Vietnam already agreed to a lot of that. So if you, and also for Vietnam, right, if you look at the history of economic reform in Vietnam, anytime Vietnam signed up to international standards and commitments, it succeeds. Anytime it tries to create its own rules using Vietnamese exceptionalism, it fails. Right? You can talk about shipbuilding, you can talk about SOE's strategy, fails. You talk about ASEAN free trade agreement, you talk about WTO, US BTA, huge successes. So again, now is the digital economy. If Vietnam on its own, my concern is that if Vietnam tries to create its own rules for the digital economy, it will fail. Right? Yes. Right. So the good thing, if part of IPEF coming out of it is a digital economy agreement, right? That set standards, right, for Vietnam to build up its tech startups. Will be a huge success, I think. But if it slows down and Vietnam, other special interest groups coming up with their own rules, right? You can forget about the digital economy, forget about the $60 billion digital economy by the end of this decade. So if, I mean, the leadership in DC and the leadership in Hanoi, right, can come to some common grounds and see the benefit in that. And for the US also, right, as I mentioned, for now, I mean, digital economy is booming in Southeast Asia. But a lot of financing, you have to say, coming within Asia, and a lot actually from China, and not from the US, right? And maybe the US can say, okay, we can hold the top technology, but it's as money talks, right? So the US, if, I mean, you want to remain, like, I mean, an important player in the digital economy and digital trade, right? You have to promote a digital agreement within IPEF. And if they both can see the seriousness and the impetus of doing that, that's the first thing they can get out of these negotiations is the digital economy agreement.
I'd like to, these are so interesting points that I'd like to add to. Actually, I have a very good example for Anh Thang's point about Vietnam's failure in protectionism. I participated in a conference reviewing the results of the advertising law organized by the Ministry of Culture in Haiphong the other day. And the Vice Minister in charge of that law from the Ministry of Culture said, when we passed this law more than 10 years ago, we hope that, you know, with some sort of, you know, protectionism provisions in the law, the local advertising industry, i.e. local advertising companies, right, would flourish. But after 10 years, right, they're nowhere near what we expected. So protectionism just doesn't work. So in the upcoming revision of the law, we believe that we should introduce more competition so that the local industry can feel the heat to grow themselves. That is a very progressive thinking in a regulatory agency, right? And the Ministry of Culture also was the drafter of the recent cinema law that was passed by the National Assembly recently. And in that law, against some opposition, it dropped some key protectionism, some key controls that on the internet streaming service, especially for offshore internet streaming, video streaming service. So that's a very encouraging trend among, in the rule-making process in Vietnam. Now, going back to IPEF, I think why the governments are still waiting to negotiate with each other on the specifics, the private sector has already found it to be useful. We, in our work across ASEAN, especially in Vietnam, have been leveraging the points in IPEF in our policy advocacy work with the government. For example, currently, various agencies in Vietnam are either revising or drafting new regulations regarding the digital economy, right? And we find a lot of them very concerning. Provisions such as data residency, mandated local presence, and the controls over the cross-border data flow, right? Those are the things that work against the development of the digital economy. And so the good news is we have been able to leverage IPEF so that the top level of decision makers in the government agreed to take a pause on all these pending regulations and say, and throw them back to the drafting agencies and say, let's continue to consult with industry. And perhaps they also think that let's wait until what IPEF will come out, how IPEF will come out before Vietnam should make such important decisions as passing these regulations on the digital economy.
I think that this very interesting example about, I think, the commitment that the top leader made and also the reaction of the whole system. And so that's why I would like to follow with the questions for Dr. Pincus, because you mentioned about the middle income child that other, I think, our neighbors in Southeast Asia is facing. And one thing that you mentioned a lot about, I think, the motivation of the government, of the system, of the whole system, to continue reform, to develop. And Dr. Xuân Thành, Professor Xuân Thành also made a very, I think, interesting observation that anytime when Vietnam faces the outside, the external pressure and sign up for commitment externally, that it creates the momentum for the internal system to do the reforms. So my question for you is that could we expect like the new initiative like IPEF or other initiatives, the external as a pressure for Vietnam to keep changing? And do you feel, because you work a lot with the government, you advise a lot of state agencies, do you feel the same level, the same degree of motivation and momentum as you observe when Vietnam joined sign up US, BTA and WTO?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I agree completely with Xuân Thành about Vietnam's reform trajectory, that when Vietnam has decided to compete, it has succeeded. And when Vietnam has attempted to avoid competition, it has made mistakes. And I think that holds true. I would say there's one exception to that, which is finance. And the reason I say that is what we've learned from the other middle-income countries of Southeast Asia is that finance is not a normal good, right? Finance is not like exporting fish or computer chips or mobile phones. Finance financial markets behave differently than normal goods. And it's very easy for a small economy to be overwhelmed by international capital flows because these capital flows can change direction very quickly. And we experienced that in 2008 in Vietnam when we had a massive boom, a big bubble in asset markets and then a crash, partly brought about by the global financial crisis. And then we had a long period of recovery because it's very difficult to recover from those periods of excessive capital flows and then capital flight. And I think to compare Vietnam to some of the neighbors, I think some of the neighbors will struggle now in the coming years because they overborrowed when interest rates globally were zero or close to zero. And now interest rates are rising in the US and in Europe, and some of these countries who have very internationalized capital markets will struggle. For example, 40% of Indonesia's rupiah bonds, government bonds, are owned by foreigners. And when they dump those bonds because interest rates are rising in the US, Indonesia is going to have to raise its interest rates quite substantially in order to prevent capital outflows. And that is a lesson that Vietnam learned, I think, during the East Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis. And the percentage of Vietnam Dong bonds owned by foreigners is 1%. And it's going to stay that way. So I think finance is an exception. I think there's a reason to be very careful about globalizing your financial markets. But in every other instance, in every other market, I'm in complete agreement that Vietnam is extremely competitive as an exporter and will be extremely competitive in the digital economy and will also be I think a regional and a global force to reckon with in these markets. If it, as Xuan Thanh is saying, accepts global standards, plays by global rules, Vietnam will succeed. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And in this regard, the US market is extremely important. And I say that because sometimes I read in the press, deglobalization, slowbalization, friend shoring, and all of these things that we're supposed to, a lot of people telling us we're supposed to turn our back on globalization and welcome in this new era of regionalization or protectionism. I don't think so. I think that globalization is here to stay in most things. There will be exceptions, but I think that the US as a major importer, as the world's largest economy, as, if you like, the consumer of last resort, I think that's here to stay. We shouldn't follow the advice of people who tell us to reduce our exposure to the US. I think that would be unwise. I think there are tremendous opportunities in the future, even with protectionist sentiment in the US politically and in some quarters economically, but nevertheless, I think the general trend still holds, which is that Vietnam produces many of the things that the US cannot produce cheaply at home, will continue to do so, and hopefully, in my competitive dynamic framework, will increasingly produce those dynamic commodities that are growing as a share of US imports. And I think that will happen. But as Xuan Thanh says, it will happen if Vietnam plays by global rules and adopts these global standards. And that's in digital technology, and it's also in agricultural products, and it's in you know, a wide range of services as well. That if Vietnam decides to compete along with global standards, that that Vietnam will succeed. Now, you know, having said that, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's fair, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that these global standards are objective and they're always to the benefit of developing countries to follow them, that, you know, they don't penalize developing countries, and so they do. It's not fair. The power lies with the rich countries. I mean, that's not headline news, right? We know that. Nevertheless, global standards are good for developing countries because at least they set standards, they set some kinds of rules that may be hard to follow, but it's always better than no rules, having some rules. And I think these standards create opportunities for competitive economies. And I think that to the extent that these new agreements or these new negotiations generate standards that set some rules, that set some boundaries, some guidelines for what it takes to integrate your economy, they are good for Vietnam, because Vietnam will do well, will compete successfully if it decides to continue along the path that's been so successful for the past 30 years and engage with the global economy.